Here are the stories shaping the world this morning, June 19th, and why they matter. The White House says a memorandum of understanding to end the U.S.-Iran conflict has been signed and is now in effect, even as further talks and a formal signing ceremony in Switzerland are still expected. President Donald Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian reportedly signed the memorandum ahead of a planned Friday ceremony. Axios reported that additional talks were expected at the Bergenstock Resort in Switzerland, with Vice President J.D. Vance leading the U.S. delegation and Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf representing Iran. A senior U.S. official said the agreement has 14 points. The 60-day accord includes provisions on navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important oil shipping routes. The document reportedly says Iran will make its best efforts to ensure safe passage for commercial vessels, with no charge for 60 days. Iranian media, however, quoted Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Bagher as saying Tehran would still collect fees for services it provides in the strait, and that Iran had nearly completed arrangements with Oman on management of the waterway. The agreement includes sanctions relief, the unfreezing of Iranian assets, a resumption of oil sales, and a proposed $300 billion U.S.-led development fund. Trump said the United States was under pressure because global oil supplies had dwindled to 4 weeks of reserve. The president warned that if the deal is not completed in 60 days, we go back to bombing, while adding that he was not concerned as long as Iran complies. Reaction in Washington has been sharply divided. Republican critics said the deal restores the pre-war status quo while leaving Iran's regime intact. Senator Bill Cassidy called it the worst foreign policy blunder in decades. The agreement has also raised concerns in Lebanon because it calls for a halt to fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, even though neither Israel nor Hezbollah was part of the negotiations. Lebanon and Israel have been holding direct talks since April, with a fifth round expected June 22nd in Washington. Israeli withdrawal, Hezbollah disarmament, and continued fighting in southern Lebanon are all expected to be on that agenda. For families across the region, the immediate question is whether a 60-day pause can become something more durable. For workers and businesses, especially in shipping and energy, stability in the Strait of Hormuz would mean lower risk, steadier prices, and fewer disruptions. But the deal's unanswered questions show how difficult it is to move from a temporary understanding to a broader peace. Ukraine launched drone attacks that forced flight suspensions at major Moscow airports, while NATO defense ministers met in Brussels to debate support for Kyiv, military spending, and the future U.S. troop presence in Europe. Russian authorities said nearly 200 drones were shot down, including at least 180 over Moscow. Russian media described it as the largest attack on the capital in 2 years. Ukraine said it targeted an oil refinery in Moscow for the second time that week, calling the strike a justified response to Russian attacks and to facilities that sustain Russia's war machine. Footage showed thick black smoke. An apartment building and a shopping center were also hit. Moscow's busiest airport evacuated passengers, and flights at all major Moscow airports were suspended for safety reasons. At the same time, air raid alerts sounded across Ukraine as Kyiv was targeted by Russia for the second time that week. For civilians on both sides, the latest attacks meant disrupted travel, damaged buildings, and another reminder that the war is reaching deeper into daily life far from the front lines. In Brussels, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky joined NATO defense ministers for talks on military support. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said discussions were continuing to make sure Kyiv has what it needs. He also cited reports of Russian losses of around 35,000 troops a month. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth called for what he described as a NATO 3.0 reboot. He said NATO should become a hardline military alliance, pressed allies to increase defense spending, and announced a review of the U.S. force presence in Europe within 6 months. The Trump administration is planning to cut back the number of troops and military equipment it would provide allies if they came under attack. Hegseth also accused allies of failing to support the U.S. war with Iran, saying they had refused or criticized American requests to use European bases or ports for strikes on Iranian targets. For European governments, the debate is about budgets, security guarantees, and long-term dependence on the United States. For ordinary people in Ukraine, it is more immediate. Whether air defenses, ammunition, and long-range weapons arrive fast enough to protect homes, schools, power stations, and workplaces. And for families across Europe, the question is how leaders balance stronger defense with the public services and economic support people also rely on. The three-day G7 summit in France closed with 9 joint declarations rather than a single communiqué, with leaders addressing Ukraine, Iran, nuclear weapons, and the security of global energy routes. French President Emmanuel Macron called the summit a moment of unity and cooperation. The G7 members agreed to prevent Tehran from acquiring nuclear weapons and committed to accelerating the diversification of energy supply routes in order to reduce vulnerability to disruption around the Strait of Hormuz. Leaders also declared unwavering support for Ukraine and agreed to send more long-range weapons. That marked a notable shift from the previous year's G7 summit, when Trump left on the first day and skipped Ukraine discussions. This time, he stayed and met with President Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump also hinted that the United States could reimpose crude oil sanctions on Russia. Macron said Trump had acknowledged that Moscow had shown no serious willingness to discuss peace and described the shared commitment to Ukraine as a real change. The decision to issue 9 declarations instead of one broad communiqué reflected the range of challenges facing the group: war, energy, nuclear risk, and economic pressure. But it also showed that the G7 members were still able to agree on some core points. For people far from diplomatic meetings, these decisions can shape the price of fuel, the stability of supply chains, and the resources available for Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. The constructive signal from France was that major democracies are still looking for shared action, even when they disagree on tactics and timelines. France is facing a heat wave expected to last into the following week, with weather warnings across the center and east of the country, and local authorities taking steps to protect students, older residents, and other vulnerable people. Temperatures were expected to reach 30 degrees Celsius early next week, with later peaks forecast in the high 30s in northern France and up to 40 degrees in the south. A forecaster said some areas could come close to records or break them. The heat is coinciding with baccalaureate exams, a major moment for students and families. Schools adjusted schedules to avoid the hottest part of the day, including starting exams at 8 a.m. Some local authorities added cooling measures quickly. One town in the Paris suburbs installed 20 ceiling fans in 2 nights. Another town, Suntal, has 24 schools, all equipped with portable air conditioners and UV-blocking film on sun-exposed windows. Officials there said the measures produced a 4 to 5 degree temperature difference between outside and inside. Sprinklers and paddling pools were also used during school break periods. The town's heat protection measures cost €541,000. That is a substantial local investment, but one increasingly seen as part of adapting public services to a hotter climate. For parents, teachers, and students, the issue is not abstract. Heat affects concentration, sleep, transport, and health. The response in France shows both the strain of rising temperatures and the practical steps communities can take: earlier schedules, shaded spaces, fans, window films, water access, and targeted protection for people most at risk. Leaders from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations met Russian President Vladimir Putin in Kazan for a 2-day summit focused on security, trade, and energy cooperation. 11 delegates from ASEAN attended the gathering, which ran through Thursday. The Kremlin said security, trade, and other topics were on the agenda. Participants were expected to sign a new declaration and a joint statement on partnership and energy cooperation. ASEAN leaders also held one-on-one meetings with Putin. Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim thanked Putin for Russian support on energy. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. said trade was steady, but added that there was a great deal more the countries could do. The summit gives Moscow a chance to strengthen diplomatic leverage despite G7 sanctions. It also reflects the practical pressure many countries face from high fuel prices and energy insecurity. For households and workers across Southeast Asia, energy ties are not just foreign policy. They affect electricity bills, transport costs, food prices, and the competitiveness of local industries. Governments in the region are trying to secure affordable supplies while also navigating the diplomatic risks of closer engagement with Russia during the war in Ukraine. The meeting in Kazan underlines a wider global reality. Many countries do not see the world only through a Washington versus Moscow lens. They are making choices based on fuel, trade, jobs, and national interests. That does not erase concerns about sanctions or the war, but it does explain why energy diplomacy remains so active. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met President Donald Trump on the sidelines of the G7 summit in France and urged cooperation to protect crews on ships in the Middle East, especially around the Strait of Hormuz. Modi said hundreds of thousands of Indian seafarers work across global maritime trade routes, including through the Strait. His comments followed a U.S. attack on a commercial ship off the coast of Oman earlier in the month that killed 3 Indian crew members. Asked about condolences, Trump said, "I do. I heard about that. It's a rough profession." He said the United States and India would work together on the issue. For India, the safety of seafarers is a major labor and family issue. Maritime work supports households across the country, often through long months away from home and in difficult conditions. When tensions rise in the Middle East, it is crew members, not just governments and shipping companies, who face the danger first. The leaders also discussed trade. U.S.-India ties have been complicated by disputes over tariffs and energy purchases. The Trump administration imposed steep tariffs on India the previous year, partly over India's purchases of Russian oil. The two countries have been negotiating an interim trade deal, and Trump said an agreement was very close. He praised Modi and said the countries had a close relationship. A trade deal could affect manufacturers, farmers, technology firms, and consumers in both countries. But Modi's public emphasis on seafarers brought attention back to the people who keep global trade moving, the workers on ships, often operating in tense waters with limited public recognition. Trump also addressed a February strike on an elementary school in Iran's Hormuzgan province that reportedly killed more than 160 people, most of them children. The strike occurred on February 28th, the first day of the U.S. offensive on Iran. The target was an elementary school in the southern province of Hormuzgan. In early March, Trump insinuated that Iran was to blame. But video analysis by an investigative group and others said the U.S. military was responsible. Asked whether anyone in his administration would be held accountable, Trump said the issue was under investigation. He said, "Nobody did that on purpose," and added that mistakes are made in wars. He did not identify who was responsible. The deaths of children in a school are among the gravest consequences of war. The central questions now are accountability, transparency, and whether the investigation will be public enough to satisfy grieving families and the wider international community. For families in Hormuzgan, the issue is not only who fired the weapon, but whether anyone in power will fully explain how a school became a target, what safeguards failed, and what will be done to prevent another such strike. The case also matters beyond Iran. Civilian protection is a core obligation in war, and when powerful militaries make mistakes, credible investigations are essential. Without them, public trust erodes, and communities already suffering from conflict are left with grief and uncertainty instead of answers. Vietnamese police rescued more than 400 stolen cats and detained 9 people in what state-run media described as one of the largest cat meat crime ring cases authorities have uncovered. The case followed investigations into cat thefts in and around Ho Chi Minh City. Investigators said the alleged group trapped and collected cats for 3 years before selling them to intermediaries for more than $2.50 per kilogram. An animal welfare organization said it had reunited about 40 cats with their owners. For those families, the case brought rare good news after what is often a painful and frustrating crime. Cat and dog theft is widespread in Vietnam. Consumption of cat and dog meat is legal in the country, but authorities are tightening trading controls to combat criminal activity. The issue sits at the intersection of animal welfare, property crime, food regulation, and public health. Even where consumption is legal, theft and unregulated trade create risks for communities. Stronger enforcement can protect pet owners, reduce criminal networks, and improve oversight of markets. For ordinary residents around Ho Chi Minh City, the rescue is a reminder that small domestic losses can be part of larger organized activity. The police action also shows that enforcement can make a practical difference, especially when investigations respond to repeated reports from the public. Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar said he is cutting all contact with the European Union's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, accusing her of comparing Israel to South Africa's former apartheid regime. The European outlet Euractiv reported that Kallas made the comments during a meeting with Mexican government officials the previous month. Sa'ar's response comes at a time when EU-Israel relations are already deeply strained since the October 2023 attacks that started the war in Gaza. The diplomatic break adds another layer of tension between Israel and the European Union. For European governments, the war has sharpened debates over humanitarian law, security, civilian casualties, and the limits of diplomatic language. For Israel, comparisons to apartheid are seen by many officials as a serious accusation that they reject strongly. the practical impact of such a dispute can reach beyond official meetings. EU-Israel cooperation touches trade, research, travel, security coordination, and humanitarian diplomacy. When top officials stop speaking, it becomes harder to manage disagreements, protect civilians, and find channels for de-escalation. At the same time, the controversy reflects broader pressure from human rights groups, voters, and governments demanding clearer answers about conditions in Gaza and the future of Palestinians and Israelis alike. The path forward will require more than public rebukes. It will require diplomacy that can handle hard criticism while keeping open the channels needed to reduce harm and support a just, secure future for ordinary people on both sides. Follow for a daily world brief. Sources are linked in the description. That's the world, as Minerva saw it.